From zany sitcoms to blockbuster films, television and movies of the 1980s were totally awesome. In this blast from the past, we'll revisit some of our favorites to learn what this media said about American society at the time. And we'll talk about the legacy it had on a generation of kids who grew up watching it and the media they consume today. I'm Bridget Kies, Assistant Professor of Film Studies and Production here at Oakland, and 1980s media is my research specialty. While we can't cover everything in this presentation, we'll talk about the rise of blockbuster action movies, television dramas that are back on TV today, and a weird trend in 1980s sitcoms that just might have contributed to a more diverse American society. These three examples encompass some of the most popular trends in 1980s movies and television, and I argue, tell us the impact of the 1980s on American culture today. For most scholars and critics, the story of the 1980s begins with Ronald Reagan, whose conservative principles and rugged masculinity left an impact on the depiction of men in film and television. But I argue the real story of the 1980s begins a few years earlier, with the election of Jimmy Carter in 1977, the rise of second-wave feminism, and the gay liberation movement. As president, Carter laid the seeds for a changed relationship between the president and the television industry. In order to lift the veil of secrecy that was cast over the White House under Nixon, Carter allowed the press greater access to his administration and appeared on television more frequently than presidents in the past had. His inauguration was the cover story of TV Guide on January 15, 1977, with an article describing how the parade would be shot with cameras mounted to the motorcade for closer access. The White House also announced plans to bring back the fireside chat popularized by Franklin D. Roosevelt, only through television this time instead of radio. According to Time magazine, who named Carter as its Man of the Year in 1977, Carter gave new pride to the South, and his soft-spoken, gentle demeanor went far to heal the wounds of a nation still aching from the loss in Vietnam and the resignation of President Nixon. Carter was what sociologists were calling a new man, a man who was attuned to feminism, gay rights, and the Black civil rights movement. Carter's presidency only lasted one term, and a crisis with American hostages in Iran is often cited as the reason he lost re-election. In reality, there are probably numerous contributing factors to his loss and Reagan's victory in the 1980 election, not the least of which had to do with Carter's personality. Although television was what made his presidency initially seem appealing, television might have also been his downfall. As media scholar Roger Straitmatter has observed, presidents and candidates who are gregarious and appealing receive far more media coverage. For sociologist Michael Kimmel, the cowboy is the quintessential image of American masculinity. The cowboy was embodied by Reagan, who Kimmel says came riding into the White House from his Western ranch. Cowboys and tough guys were in by 1980, and new men were out. They weren't seen as sensitive anymore. They were just wimps. In contrast to Carter, Reagan's presidency was especially marked by moments of televisual masculine bravado. Political communication scholar Robert Denton calls Reagan a prime-time president who knew how to use television to portray himself as likable and effective. But with Reagan's election, the image of the gentle new man embodied by Carter didn't completely die out. Instead, I argue, the new man and the cowboy, as embodied by Carter and Reagan, became the core archetypes through which film and television depicted men and masculinity and tried to appeal to new audiences. And the most obvious example of this was the action movie. The idea of a blockbuster movie was still relatively new in the 1980s. Most film historians trace the rise of the blockbuster to Jaws, which was released in 1975. And they describe the blockbuster as a film that has a lot of marketing and hype before its release, is made with a giant budget, and most of that budget goes to special effects. One criticism the blockbuster receives is that it's meant to be watched just for fun. But actually, blockbuster movies, especially 1980s action movies, tell us a lot about what society valued at the time, namely capitalism and extreme masculinity. In the 1988 film Die Hard, the villain, Hans Gruber, played by Alan Rickman, is trying to steal millions of dollars in untraceable bearer bonds. He takes an entire building full of people hostage to do this, but he doesn't realize that Bruce Willis's character, John McClane, is also in the building and trying to stop him. Gruber is German, and the corporation he's stealing from is Japanese, with an office in Los Angeles. So the film immediately sets up that global capitalism is something that needs to be protected. And to do that, John McClane, who was just an ordinary, dull kind of guy, enacts a lot of violence and becomes a vigilante hero when law enforcement lets him down. In fact, he's such a quintessential example of American masculinity that Hans Gruber calls him a cowboy throughout the film, as if associating McClane with the image of Reagan, the cowboy president. At the end of the movie, McClane's wife takes his name after she's been using her maiden name in her professional career. It's a step backward for her feminism as she reclaims her position as wife and mother because she's so enamored with her husband's heroic cowboy vigilante acts. Over the course of the movie, McClane becomes what Susan Jeffers calls a hard body, a muscular man whose strength and power propels an action movie forward. Jeffers sees these 1980s action characters as Reagan heroes, whose individual bodies become symbolic of the nation under Reagan and his tough foreign policy and Reaganomics. But you might be thinking, wait a second, Bruce Willis is a hard body? Well, you're right. He's not that strong, and the role was supposed to go to someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger. But actually, the fact that he's kind of ordinary makes my point, because the film asks him to rise to the challenge and become stronger than he thought. But let me give you another example of a hard body in 1980s action movies to make my comparison to Reagan a little clearer. In the first Rambo movie, First Blood, Sylvester Stallone plays a former Green Beret who carries a lot of emotional and physical trauma from his time in the Vietnam War. By the second movie, producers had realized that the Vietnam storyline was much more interesting than Rambo on the home front. So they sent the character back to Vietnam to locate missing POWs. The result is a lot of shirtless gunslinging, showing off Stallone's muscles as an allegory for American foreign power. It's no coincidence then that there was a poster of a hyper-muscular Ronald Reagan imitating Rambo First Blood 2. Ronbo takes the power Reagan expressed through policy and speeches and turns it into physical might through muscles and bullets. By 1993, the hard body had become so influential beyond action movies that it actually became normalized. Yvonne Tasker says part of this was that men like Arnold Schwarzenegger had moved from athletic sports to mainstream film roles, where rugged clothing and a strong muscular physique had once been a source of embarrassment because they were associated with the working class and manual labor. Now the hard body was the masculine ideal for all social classes, and probably emblematic of the fact that a man had extra money to spend on things like personal training. On television, the hard body had a kind of reverse effect, since the more men revealed their bodies, the more they invited speculation about their sexuality, and the more they allowed women to ogle them, the way men had been ogling women on television for years. During the late 1970s, ABC television president Fred Silverman scheduled new shows full of sex and sexuality that he thought would attract an audience back to the network. Competitor Paul Klein of NBC dubbed this the Jiggle Era. On shows like Three's Company, women were scantily clad and constantly found themselves in sexualized situations. Charlie's Angels is an action series that, on one level, is about the power of women working together, but on another level, the Angels' work at the detective agency requires them to put on different costumes and disguises week after week in a veritable pageant for the television viewer's gaze. By 1981, shows like Charlie's Angels were canceled as mainstream television turned back to more wholesome fare, and most TV historians mark this as the end of the Jiggle era. But I argue that this era actually continued with a twist. It became more common to see the exploitation of men's bodies. As more American women entered the corporate workplace in the 1980s, their newfound wealth made them attractive to advertisers, and television began to target them as audiences. The result was lots of eye candy for women. The same hard bodies from action movies, now on television in series with men who were strong, but also sensitive. The series Magnum P.I. is a kind of gender reversal of Charlie's Angels for the 1980s. Like the Angels, Thomas Magnum, played by Tom Selleck, is supported by a wealthy but unseen benefactor. For the Angels, it's Charlie, who is heard but never seen as he notifies the Angels of their assignments through his private detective agency. Magnum lives on an estate in Hawaii that is owned by Robin Masters, someone Magnum has never even seen. The Angels are guarded by Bosley, played by David Doyle, a sexless older man who never quite gets his hands as dirty as them, but who is nevertheless charged with protecting them. Magnum has Higgins, played by John Hillerman, the caretaker of Robin Masters' estate, who gets Magnum out of trouble and enjoys a begrudging friendship with him. Just as Charlie's Angels can be interpreted as a feminist series that allows women to work together, or an anti-feminist series that puts women's bodies on display, or both, Magnum P.I. invites a viewer who wants to see a man in power, solving crimes, but also a man who is sensitive, haunted by his experiences in Vietnam, and very likely to wear short shorts or take off his shirt. In fact, after a few seasons as his costumes got skimpier and skimpier, Tom Selleck begged the show's producers to let him wear pants. Putting men's bodies on displays wasn't unique to Magnum P.I. On Miami Vice, Don Johnson, played by the lead character Sonny Crockett, was outfitted in stylish suit jackets that actually inspired a men's fashion craze and encouraged men to shop more and think more about their appearances. On MacGyver, which was much more of a family show than Magnum P.I. or Miami Vice, lead actor Richard Dean Anderson was shown in tight close-ups that emphasized his facial beauty. And in fact, he'd been named as one of the most beautiful soap actors on television before he landed the role of MacGyver. If the 1970s were the jiggle era in which women's bodies were on display, the 1980s were a reversal of that, changing who was doing the jiggling and for whom. Television executives understood that middle and upper class working women were growing in numbers and in affluence. And although we typically think of action series as men's genres, it's pretty clear that in the 1980s, producers wanted women to watch these shows too, and they weren't afraid to show off the bodies of their handsome, muscular lead actors to attract women viewers. But hard bodies weren't the only kind of men on television in the 1980s. At the beginning of this presentation, I said the 80s were a period in which the Reagan-era cowboy clashed with the Carter-era new man. The cowboy, the hard body, might have thrived in action movies and action series like Magnum P.I. But on TV sitcoms, the new man was everywhere. The 1983 feature film Mr. Mom shows Michael Keaton's character Jack becoming a stay-at-home dad when he's laid off from his job as an executive at a car manufacturing company. To keep the family afloat, his wife lands a job at an advertising firm. The comedy of the movie comes from how terrible Jack is at cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the kids. And the movie ends with him being rehired at work, back where he belongs. Characters like Jack, whom I call collectively Mr. Moms, were all over television in the 1980s. Taken individually, any one of these Mr. Moms sitcoms might be something exceptional, but television operates by what media scholar Todd Gitlin calls recombinant culture, where one successful show spawns spin-offs and copycats. And this overall trend of Mr. Mom on primetime is what tells us how much the dynamics of the American family were changing in the 1980s. Series like Family Ties and Growing Pains featured families with two working parents who shared household duties. The goal in these families was marital egalitarianism, and sometimes that was more an ideal than an achievement. But the dialogue and the plot lines emphasize the need for men to be what historian Anthony Rotundo terms participant fathers, who are actively involved in family matters. In fact, on Family Ties, the dad Stephen, played by Michael Gross, drove carpool cooked, cleaned, and organized his career around his family's needs so that his wife could thrive in her career as architect and family breadwinner. On series like Who's the Boss?, Charles in Charge, and Mr. Belvedere, male domestic workers were solely responsible for childcare, cooking, and cleaning, while the mother worked outside the home. In the case of these 3 series, the men prove more skilled at household labor than the moms were. As in the film Mr. Mom, the humor of these shows often stems from the juxtaposition of masculinity and domesticity. For instance, the opening credits to Who's the Boss feature housekeeper Tony, played by Tony Danza, vacuuming the drapes by lifting the vacuum over his head in an overhead press that reveals his bulging biceps. But unlike the film Mr. Mom, these domestic dads were good at their jobs. They can cook, clean, keep the family organized and happy, and they often function as surrogate parents to the children, leaving the mother free to pursue her career outside the home. By the late 1980s, the idea of men in charge of the household went so far that there were series without moms at all. On My Two Dads, 2 single men live together and co-parent Nicole, an orphan who might be the biological child of one of them. Although they're not a gay couple on the show, the 2 dads live together. They quarrel over how to raise Nicole, and they do pretty much everything we'd expect to see of a 2-parent household, except neither is the wife or the mother. But probably the most famous example is Full House. On this show, 3 men live together to raise 3 daughters after the wife mother has died. There's what I call the lead dad, Danny, played by Bob Saget, who's the household breadwinner and biological dad to the kids. What I call helper dads, Jesse and Joey, played by John Stamos and Dave Coulier, mostly work at home. They raise the girls, and the humor of the show is juxtaposing their masculinity with the feminizing domestic duties they have to undertake. Let's watch a clip from the first season in which lead dad Danny comes home late, only to face the wrath of helper dad Jesse.
Hi, honey, I'm home. Hi, girls. I'm sorry I'm late. At the last minute, I had to rush out to Oakland to cover a Warriors practice session. Traffic was miserable.
Give me a break.
Huh?
Don't hunt me. You waltz in here 25 minutes late and expect sympathy?
Well, I didn't know you had...
I have cleaned the house and washed the and ran a daycare center for socially deviant munchkins and missed Oprah. Ran this one to a ballet lesson, this one to the dentist. No cavities, thank you very much. Do you realize that I have slaved over a hot stove so you could have a hot meal when you come home? Huh?
Jesse, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Sorry. Sorry doesn't change the fact that my chicken tetrazzini is ruined. Ruined. It's all dried out. But do you have the common courtesy to call me and tell me you're going to be 25 minutes late? No! I am not an animal. Oh my God, what's happening to me? I'm turning into June Cleaver.
In my reading of Full House, I talk about how any attempt to create a traditional 2-parent heterosexual family is thwarted in favor of this alternative family structure. When Jesse gets married in later seasons, for instance, he's so sad about leaving the house that he just moves his new wife in. Over the course of its 8 seasons, Full House reiterates a conservative value of family as the most important thing in life. But it also asserts over and over again that family doesn't have to look the way it does on Leave It to Beaver, even if Uncle Jesse makes comparisons between himself and June Cleaver. By the 1987-88 television season, not a single new domestic sitcom featured a traditional mother. And because these shows weren't a film with closed narrative, they emphasized week after week how normal it was for men to take up domestic duties, even if they encouraged us to sometimes laugh at the men as they did this. And they showed us how normal it was for moms to work outside the home. The gender role reversal was shown as complex, and there were sometimes frustrating or comedic side effects, but the role reversal was also shown to bring about family harmony. These shows offered a fantasy for working women, liberating her from the domestic sphere until actually she became completely unnecessary to the family structure. And with her out of the house, men were able to claim it. So while some critics like Susan Faludi call these series a backlash toward feminism, I think it's important to pay attention to how progressive the depictions of masculinity and male gender roles were, and the way they clashed with Reagan-era conservatism and the politics of traditional family values. By both liberating Mom and exiling her, and freeing men from expectations of masculinity, but enslaving them in the home, Mr. Mom's sitcoms reveal the anxieties that were shared between feminist and anti-feminist factions over the changing family at the time. The cultural impact of Mr. Mom's sitcoms is hard to overestimate. Most Mr. Mom sitcoms were canceled by the mid-1990s, but they were in syndicated reruns all through the 90s and remain so today. Many of these series simply never left TV, and at least one, probably more, generation of kids grew up watching them, seeing men's involvement in domestic affairs totally normalized. Now that the kids who grew up watching these movies and TV shows are adults with their own disposable income, nostalgia for the 1980s is everywhere. Remakes of MacGyver and Magnum P.I. came back to television with a huge change of making Higgins, the one who keeps Magnum out of trouble, a woman. Miami Vice was made a feature film in 2006, and the Rambo movies had a new and maybe final installment in 2019. And of course, Full House became Fuller House, with a revival on Netflix in which the daughters of the family are now adults, raising 3 sons in the same house, and again, without the traditional heterosexual nuclear family structure. Fuller House serves as an interesting case study in how nostalgia for the 1980s shapes media culture today. Because it's now 3 women cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing, there's a return to a traditional female gender role in the family, an erasure of what made the original Full House so unique and so full of queer promise. Fuller House also has constant references to the original series through in-jokes, character appearances, and parallel plot lines, as well as the use of a laugh track, which is pretty uncommon in sitcoms today. Altogether, this makes the experience of watching more nostalgic than its forward-looking antecedent. In an era of same-sex marriage and rising numbers of single parents and unmarried couples who cohabitate, Fuller House wants us to long for a nostalgic return to a more traditional 80s. But as I've shown here, it's an imaginary 80s, because in reality, television and film of the 1980s showed incredibly complex gender and family dynamics. Our 3 examples, action movies, action TV series, and sitcoms, show how the 1980s saw tension between the Reagan-era cowboy and the Carter-era new man, and how the impact of these changing images of masculinity might have affected the generation of kids who watched and a generation of film and television to come. I'm Bridget Kies. Thanks for listening.